Hello to the Open House Worldwide Festival and welcome to London. My name is Merlin Fulcher. I'm the Open House Worldwide Director of Tours and I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Harper. I'm Director of Open City.
Fantastic. And so today we're giving you a tour of the City of London, the historic ancient core of London. It's a city of many architectural styles and many eras. It's also a city of some very epic views. And it's also a city of some fantastic streets. So we're going to try and bring all of that to you this morning. We're starting on the south side of the River Thames. So the City of London is to the north of the River Thames. Okay, thanks. We've got the City Hall to our right, which is the centre of the municipality of Greater London. But across the river, we've got the skyline of the city itself. So you can see those towers clustered together. We're about to go over to those towers. We're going to delve into it and see the epic views. But let's see it first from this side. The big chunky one on the left is what we call here the walkie-talkie. It's by Raphael Vanoli, architect. It's a skyscraper, it's an office building. It gets bigger the higher up it goes, a bit like these old medieval houses we have in London, which get bigger and bigger and bigger the higher up they go. Next to it you can see things like the Gherkin, the Scalpel, the Cheese Grater, 22 Bishopsgate. These will all be very familiar later in the tour as you get to see more of them.
Something curious about London is that you can't have a tall building without giving it a kind of humorous and familiar name.
Exactly. We love that kind of affectional quality of a humorous name that goes with a building. But we chose to be here because we wanted to show you some epic views of London, and one of those epic views is Tower Bridge. So Tower Bridge, this extraordinary gateway to the City of London, gateway to London, gateway you could say to Britain. This is a building from roughly 1888. It's designed by an architect called Horace Jones, and we're going to hear more about Horace Jones in due course. This is a Grade 1 listed building, and I'm saying this because these listings, they're quite interesting. Effectively, a Grade 1 listing means that it has the highest level of protection and sort of conservation that you could give to any building in the country. It effectively means that this is the kind of cultural fabric of the country that we're in. So the Grade 1 listed Tower Bridge, we're about to go over it and give you some of the sort of epic views that exist inside. I think a lot of people listening are going to be fairly familiar with this one. It's a bascule bridge, and what that means is that it opens up. Fingers crossed it doesn't open up while we're cycling across it today. Just going to give a gaze on it. Nah, I don't see any sign of any boat about to go under. What about you, Finn? Can you see any?
I very rarely have seen this bridge open, but it does do it, and
it does do it.
It's quite a thing. So, when was it built? How old is this bridge? Because it looks kind of like a medieval, right? But it's deceptive.
This is one really interesting bit of architecture. In a way, I think you could describe it, Finn, as a set piece. Do you think that's fair? It kind of sets the stage, but it does that in this very medieval way.
So this is a very new development here. I think this was completed, in the last couple of years. Trying to evoke the kind of Docklands nostalgia, perhaps, these protruding balconies, recalling the kinds of balconies that barrels might have been rolled over during London's sort of trading history as a major port city.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's very evocative of that, but it also has that kind of that clean sort of urban living, that reassuringly expensive bar beneath your flat. So the Tower Bridge itself, we're now preparing to cross over it. The traffic is moving, which is another indicator that the bascules are closed. that the bridge is open to traffic. It was the reason it has this remarkable kind of opening feature is that it is a bridge designed to allow the kind of tall-masted sailing ships that were used at the time of the late 19th century to transport goods. It was designed to allow those boats to sail through and under into what is called the Pool of London. The Pool of London, which you'll see to the left as we cycle over the bridge, is a former harbour. So this was one of the greatest harbours in the world, where these tall-masted ships would sail under that bridge to bring their goods and commodities into one of the greatest marketplaces of the world, the city. And we're going to see lots of references to this as we travel our way through the rest of the tour. So this, up on this bridge, when it was built, this epic view to the left would have been of tall-masted ships and cranes and goods being unloaded. And then to the right, as you can see, the sun rising over the city, you've got Canary Wharf and the docklands beyond, the kind of regeneration zone. But this bridge was designed as a gateway, a kind of a statement, possibly you could say a statement of openness to trade, but also a statement of the kind of the bounds of British trading identity, which is this Gothic mannerism. So effectively, as a view, this says to me, bring your goods here, but then it has to be on our terms. And the terms are these kind of aesthetic terms, designed by the architect Horace Jones, who we're going to hear a bit more about later on. Horace Jones was the city architect. He worked for the City of London Corporation, so he had a very powerful role in setting the kind of aesthetic agenda at a time, you could say, when this area was at the height of its trading power, at a point when that trading power involved physical goods and commodities. As we all know now, trading power is transmorphed into sort of high-tech intangibles. We're going to see some of that intangibles later on.
So, Merlin, when people think of London, they probably think of like Greater London, the sort of
Right.
the huge metropolitan area. But we're going into the City of London, which is a different thing, right? What is the City of London?
So the City of London, it's also known as the square mile. That represents its total area, if you factor it all together. It's the ancient core of London. It's the most powerful bit of London in many ways, because it's associated with trade and commerce, but also with a kind of independence. The City of London is its own local authority. London has a system of councils and boroughs, 33 of them, that make up this mega city. And the City of London is the one in the centre. In many ways, it's probably the most powerful and influential and wealthy of them all, and it contains, in my view, some of the most interesting and compelling architecture and some of the most interesting and compelling views and streets in the city. But it is its own thing, so it's very different from other bits of London and the UK and beyond. For example, it has a kind of democracy, but the democracy, rather than votes being allotted to residents, as they are in most parts of the world, votes are allotted to businesses that occupy this place. So in a way, it's a kind of giant business improvement district. But there's, over the centuries of it operating on this way, there's been some very interesting kind of architectural outcomes that we're going to see. So we're up on the area which is known as Tower Hill. And I really like this view because this is where we have the Tower of London. The Tower of London is a fortress. It's a palace. It was built by William the Conqueror in 1078. So that is about 800 years before Tower Bridge was built. It's also a Grade 1 listed building. So what's interesting about this is that you have these two Grade 1 listed buildings side by side, and they both have the same kind of language, this language of castles and sort of medieval Gothic. So this is an extremely old building to the left, but it's also a fortress. It's a military strategic outpost, sorry. And as a set piece, it doesn't really sort of tell a relevant story to what London is now, because we don't really associate London as being a military outpost anymore, and we don't really associate it as being a place that needs defending in the kind of traditional sense, or the kind of medieval sense, from knights on horses with swords and so on. So it kind of sits in a bit of an odd space as a view. But I like to imagine, for me, when I come here, I think about the Romans who founded this city. They founded the city here a very long time ago, and in doing so, what they did was they... in fact, we can probably go along... I think we can cross over here. I can imagine...
A recurring theme of this tour might be traffic. You know, the UK is obviously in the middle of our second national lockdown, and yet, as you can see, that's not really had any dent on the amount of traffic that is storming through the centre of London at the moment. While other cities have pedestrianised their city centres and made space for cycling and walking to avoid transmission, London's kind of gone the other way, and it sort of feels like there's more traffic than ever.
Going to turn right here. So we're going from the Tower of London now onto the one of these roads that takes you into the centre of the city. You can see towers up above us. You can hear the roar of the wind. You can see it's a kind of chasm of offices. Many of these offices home to financial institutions. In the development of the city, as it went from being a centre of trade and physical trade, then became a centre of banking. In many instances, this banking started out in private houses. This was a residential quarter. The people who lived here were bankers. And then over the centuries, this then evolved to become just like a raw kind of office scape, populated by these institutions. These kind of, we're going to turn right. These sort of institutions of, you could say, brilliance and possibly of overwork among their young inhabitants who enter at the lower streams to do the sort of big thinking and aspirational career ladder climbing. It's a tough world with enormous rewards, which I think is probably why so many people are willing to try their luck in this dynamic industry that occupies these streets. So we're just passing the base of the walkie-talkie to our left, and here at this point you get another one of those epic views. You can see that it's a tower which very much gets bigger the higher up you go. Going to turn right here. And you see, one of the things you've got to notice about the City of London is the fact that everything is quite close together. I mean, that sort of goes with an area that's known as the Square Mile. But where we're approaching now is what I think is one of the most enigmatic views and streetscapes of any part of this city. This is Leadenhall Market. So, what is this? What do we see before us? It's a canopied structure. It's highly ornate. There's all kinds of classical references in the architecture. It's painted, it's gold, it's stunningly beautiful. This is another Grade 1 listed building, by the architect Horace Jones. Horace Jones, who, as we saw just a few moments ago, designed Tower Bridge. Tower Bridge, a great gateway to the city, a city of trade, and this marketplace, obviously a place of trade, originally a place of trade for food, very much inspired by the great marketplace in Milan. It is now still a marketplace, but possibly with more of a focus on dining and drinking. It's a very trendy and popular location. As you can see on the right, there's a bakery. On the left, there's a wine bar. There's a Christmas tree here. As we were saying, we're now in the sort of second wave lockdown in the city and all of the UK, and that means that pubs and restaurants and cafes are closed, sadly, but they'll be open again, ready for the Christmas rush, and that's what this tree indicates. So quite a powerful bit of city here, with all kinds of beautiful lanes, and it feels like it envelopes you. You can be here and you're in another world, you're on another journey. You're really transported to everything the city could be. Here's a pigeon, enigmatic of London. Here's all the bars. We're here on a Saturday morning, but if we were here on a Friday night in typical times, it would be buzzing and thronged with happy drinkers. But we're moving now from the 1880s to the 1970s and 1980s. We're jumping 100 years into the future. This is the trade of the city from those tangible goods to the intangible goods to another Grade 1 listed building, this time designed by the great Richard Rogers. This is Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's, one of the great insurance companies that grew from the kind of boom of the 18th century in insurance in maritime trade being one of the fruits of the British Empire, an empire which we'll discuss later in this tour with some gruesome details. But here we have before us Lloyd's of London.
It's an extraordinary building, and it kind of speaks to quite a profound shift in the architecture, not just of London, but of the UK. This is when high tech really gets quite big and muscular. Previously, the kind of high tech masters, your Norman Fosters, your Richard Rogerses, your Nick Grimshaws, and so on, would have been doing some great projects, but really at a very different scale, a much smaller scale. And all of a sudden you have Richard Rogers putting up this vast tower for one of the great financial institutions of the city. It really marks a kind of, draws a line in the sand. You know, this is the start of high tech as a global architectural movement. I'm just doing some sound level testing. My one's picking up a lot of wind, but hopefully I can cut that in the edit.
It's enormously big. It's designed for a single occupier and owner. If we think about the evolution of the City of London from being a place of these houses, these domestic premises where bankers operated, and in the case of Lloyd's it was a coffee shop where they operated, over the centuries they eventually came of age. And here in 1978, Lloyd's of London setting the aesthetic agenda for the UK and if not for the world. This is a kind of enormous statement in the confidence of technology, of computers at their earliest stage when they were just beginning to transform the way we work. It has a confidence which eclipses even what the banking industry today believes of itself. And we'll see other buildings which were built later, which have a maturity to them, but which don't have the same kind of panache and the same kind of bravery. And possibly it is hubristic, because the world it has moved on rather from this way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, also it's big, not just in like it's a big building, but like the pieces are big, right? If we sort of take a close look at it, all the elements which are highly expressed are themselves very chunky, they're very muscular, they're very big. And this, I think, also represents a shift in kind of high tech, which has its roots in the work of Fry Otto and Buckminster Fuller and these kind of early pioneers who are just trying to do more, but do it with less. That's the kind of key refrain that Buckminster Fuller comes back to. This is Richard Rogers doing more, but with more, right? It's a huge building made of huge pieces. And I think that's an interesting turning point in the kind of trajectory of this architectural language that, yes, we're trying to make buildings, and actually we want them to be shouty. We don't want them to be spindly and fiddly. We want them to have a real intensity. But maybe that's necessary when you're building in a place like the City of London, which, as we've seen in this tour, has an existing architectural language that is practically medieval military.
Yes,
how do you go up against that as a new contender in that same as a maker of buildings in the same space?
I think absolutely. I think that as a great view, it's an experience which you must come here to witness. You don't see much of this building on the skyline, unfortunately, and there is another totally epic view associated with it, and that's the interior. It has one of the most exquisite and dramatic interiors, an enormous open space with escalators and desks and historic references to the the insurance company. We can't go in today. A lot of these buildings aren't really open to the public, apart from on the open house weekend occasionally. But that is definitely one of the sort of great views of the City of London. We're going to move now. We're going to jump about 40 years into the future. So we're going from the 1970s to about the year 2010, 2011. To a building called the Leadenhall building. And this is another building by Richard Rogers. It's the exact same architect. It's a skyscraper. And what's really distinctive, and you can probably see from this, and we saw it on the other side of the river, this is a tapered building. It gets smaller the higher you get to the top. So it's basically like a giant triangle on the skyline. Which obviously it's a nice thing, but actually it's not just there for looks. The reason it does this is the building had to set back in order to protect a special view of the City of London's main religious building, which is St Paul's Cathedral. St Paul's Cathedral, designed by Christopher Wren, another Grade 1 listed building. This is the first building, this skyscraper, the Leadenhall building, is the first building on our tour which is not a listed building. As obviously it's a bit too new. It's also not a building that won any sort of major prizes. It is quite a fun building, and it's quite an interesting building because of its unique shape. It's been given the kind of the nickname the Cheese Grater. It's an office building. Unlike Lloyd's across the road, it's a multi-tenanted building. So what that means is that there's lots of different companies that are based in there, including the architecture practice of Richard Rogers. So that's a nice kind of highlight to think that the architect who designed this cityscape is now based and operating in this area. But we're going to move swiftly on from that tower to another tower. This is the first building in our tour designed by Norman Foster. It's also a Sterling Prize winning building. We're going to see another one of those as we proceed. But this building is known as 30 St Mary Axe, and it is another office tower. In London, we nickname it the Gherkin. Why? Because of its unique shape. It's the second building on our tour today that has a lovely fun feature. You can cycle around it in a circle. This came to be in the year 2004. So this was built before the Cheese Grater, but after Lloyd's of London. You could say that this was a moment where we were still very much enthused by the power of computing and the power of the internet to transform our lives. There's a kind of optimism about technology, the sort of human shape of the Gherkin, comically referencing a human body part, possibly shows our kind of naive belief that these new powers that we've unleashed could be sort of tamed and innocent and made kind of comical. That technology and its fruits would never go wrong, would never lead us to the sort of financial crisis that we saw in 2008.
Yeah, it is kind of comical. It's comical that it has a comical name, but it's also enormously popular. This is the thing I always find fascinating about the Gherkin. It's like everybody loves the Gherkin.
Yeah.
My gran loves the Gherkin. man in the street loves the Gherkin, which is quite unusual because Britain is a country which doesn't get on comfortably with contemporary or modern architecture.
Indeed.
A lot of resistance, in fact, a lot of campaigning to knock down older buildings that are for post-war or modernist in their look. And yet somehow the Gherkin has completely transcended this animosity, and there's a kind of broad consensus that it's a wonderful building, despite its highly contemporary appearance and delivery and construction and everything. And I'm kind of fascinated by this. Why do you think it is? How come the Gherkin, where so many contemporary buildings struggle to win the public, the love of the British public, the Gherkin has managed to get them on side?
I think that's a really, really interesting question that probably is useful for understanding a lot of architecture in Britain and contemporary architecture. I think with this one in particular, it was very visible on the skyline when it was built. Not so much now, but at the time, very, very visible. And it kind of invited people to make their own interpretation of it. Funnily enough, pretty much everyone made the same interpretation of it, which then invited everybody to agree that they all had an interpretation of it. And if you think that that's something that rarely contemporary architecture does, often it kind of its statement is its contextuality or its design references or its kind of daring engineering panache. But these are not things which you can sit around the breakfast table with toast and marmalade and have a chuckle about. So I think that's where the Gherkin succeeds, and that's why, in many ways, why Norman Foster is one of the greatest architects in Britain today. And has created a fantastic architectural legacy that we can enjoy in places like the City of London. So we're moving on from the Gherkin now. We're going to delve deeper into the City of London. The bit we've been in now is sometimes referred to as like the Eastern Insurance Cluster of these towers. Lots of towers here, lots of insurance companies. We're just going to, you see to the left, the kind of lift core of the Leadenhall building, the Cheese Grater. We're going to go now. We're going to go back in time. So we've just been in the future, we've been in the present, the futuristic present, and now we're going to delve a little bit deeper into a kind of historic cityscape here. So, city has always been a place of work, a place of productivity. You see, even during this period of national lockdown, here in the morning, there's a fair few people going about their business, whatever their business may be. So we're here, one of the major thoroughfares. There's another tower, that's Tower 42 by Richard Seafoot, an architect who built a lot through the 60s, 70s and 80s in Britain of commercial architecture, at a time when commercial architecture wasn't necessarily the mainstay of architecture because most architects worked in the public sector. Anyway, we're going to move on. We're going to go into the sort of deep ancient core, or the kind of Victorian, the 18th century, and the kind of, you could say, some buildings of the era of empire. So this street, which we're about to enter, is called Threadneedle Street. It's a tiny winding street full of quite beautiful ancient buildings. These are sort of ancient buildings of an earlier stage of the evolution of banking and finance. Reassuringly built of stone. These are sort of places where you could come and deposit cold hard cash transformed into investments, but it still kind of reassured you that money existed somewhere, existed in these stone edifices. So we're going along Threadneedle Street, a popular cut through to get to the ancient centre. You can see all these sort of alleyways spinning off and so forth. Here we go past some more office buildings, and you can see we've gone from the insurance cluster with its with its office skyscrapers now to the dramatic centrepiece of the square mile. We're coming up to the Bank of England. So these very solid looking walls to the right of me are the Bank of England, a place which still stores enormous quantities of gold in its vaults. What a brilliant thing to imagine. The Bank of England is another Grade 1 listed building. This one is designed by John Soane and then later modified, controversially, by Herbert Baker in the 20th century. So the Bank of England is the kind of centrepiece of this City of London, this extraordinary sort of dynamic space. It is a cluster of Grade 1 listed historic buildings. So next to the Bank of England to the right is the Royal Exchange. This is a building from 1840. The Royal Exchange, designed by William Tite, is a former stock exchange, which is now a marketplace of a bit like Leadenhall Market, very fancy restaurants and bars and fashion outlets. I think it's closed today, but it's a stunningly beautiful building. But here you really get a sense of the city. This is an iconic space, a much cherished space within the identity of London and of Britain, one might say. Possibly slightly ruined by all the traffic signs, which aren't massively sympathetic and don't necessarily enhance the gravity of this cluster of Grade 1 listed buildings. But what's very interesting is you see there's a pediment, there's lots of interesting language in these buildings around us. And one I'd like to draw your attention to is this one here with the Royal Exchange, and up above it, you won't be able to see the details so well in the camera, but I'll just explain it to you. This is an image showing various commodities being brought to market. This is built in 1840. There's various commodities being brought by people from all over the world. But it has within that image a black man on his knees holding a casket of something. And the very kind of brutal message here is that almost that he is a commodity. And this is obviously a reference to the slave trade, the trade which brought so much wealth to Britain and also to London. And this building was built in 1840, and what's so terrifying about this is 7 years after slavery was abolished in Britain and its colonies. So this shows that kind of thinking, that kind of exploitation was still real and raw enough to be carved in as a grand statement into a centrepiece building like this, which is Grade 1 listed, very much part of our cultural identity. To our other side here is the Mansion House. This is from the 1740s. It's by George Dance, and it is the home of the Lord Mayor of London. The Lord Mayor of London is the mayor. He's the ceremonial head of the City of London. This is a place of ceremony. It's where the annual Mansion House dinner happens, where the Chancellor of the Exchequer gives a speech and everyone wears white tie, which is a sort of penguin suit. It looks very silly, but it's a very important part of the, you could say, political and financial calendar. Anyway, so that's the Mansion House, another Grade 1 listed building. But in the spirit of epic views, we've just shown you this view, this iconic view of that cluster of historic buildings. I want to show you one of our favourite views in the City of London, and that's it's a building called New Court, and you have to see it here. You have to go on this lovely little alleyway behind Mansion House, and you can see New Court.
Wow. This is this sort of milky tower that's behind you. Is that the one you're talking about?
This is the one I'm talking about. So it really, I mean, on a day like this, it pretty much blends into the sky. It's pretty much invisible. But I think as an architecture, it shows a kind of maturity. It's quite low key. So who was the client? Who occupies this building? Who was it built for? Well, it was built. It's the headquarters of the Rothschild Bank, which has been here in the City of London for about 200 years. Which actually, in the City of London, obviously we've got the Tower of London's been here for 1,000 years. So 200 years isn't that. It's not really that recent. Sorry, it's not really that much of a long time compared to other institutions. But it's been enormously successful in those 200 years. And so in many ways, the sort of fortunes of the Rothschild Empire are kind of linked to the fortunes of the City of London. And it's always been based here on this spot right next to the Bank of England and next to Mansion House.
And who's the architect? Is this Norman Foster again? Is this Richard Rogers?
So this is really interesting. So this is the first architect, the first international architect on our tour today. It's designed by OMA, which means Office for Metropolitan Architecture. They're based in Rotterdam, and they're headed up by Rem Koolhaas, who's a kind of visionary architect and academic. His origins in journalism and writing and theorizing. In many ways, one of the 20th and early 21st centuries most inspirational thinkers on design and aesthetics, but who also build things. So it's an extraordinary fusion of thinking and building. So this really is a very special bit of architecture in London. It kind of represents a pinnacle of internationalism and of ideas. It's from 2011. It was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize, the greatest prize in British architecture, given to a building, not the architect. But it didn't win that prize. Obviously, it's not a listed building because it's too new. Interestingly, it's the third office building built for the banking company on this site. So it shows that the client who built it has an appetite for newness. They're quite happy just to build something, they just tear it down and build another one. So if the tradition continues, one might expect that this might be torn down at some point and rebuilt with something even newer and more contemporary. And that might be the tradition of this site, rather than it being a kind of listed and preserved building.
I guess the Rothschilds are one of those they probably think of themselves as great patrons of architecture. They're forever commissioning the greatest the architects of the age to make buildings for them. And I guess the next building that we're about to see is also an example of a kind of financial tycoon casting themselves as a great patron of architecture and producing a building that sort of tries to fit into a lineage.
Absolutely. Let's go. Let's check it out. So we've gone from this fantastic but quite discreet, but yet also quite mature banking headquarters through to another Norman Foster building. Another Norman Foster building. And you know what? It's also another Norman Foster building that won the Sterling Prize. So it's the second of its kind. Yeah. So what is this before us? Why is it built from these interestingly coloured materials? Why is it so big? Actually, you have to see how big it is, we need to show you some more views. But bearing in mind, as you've probably gathered from this cycle tour so far, a lot of the city's very compact. It's very cheek by jowl, even though if it is quite homogenous in terms of banking institutions. It's certainly in the architecture, there's lots of different things all smashed right next to each other in quite a pleasing way. Now, this building that we're outside, I'm going to name it finally, it's called the Bloomberg building. It's a media centre for Bloomberg, which is an amazing media company, most associated with financial reporting. But obviously financial reporting and media and news being very important to trade and finance. You need to know what's going on to know the value of everything, right? So it's only natural that this should be pride of place in the centre of the City of London. So it's a media centre, it's huge, it's a £1 billion building.
Gosh. I heard it was more.
Yeah, I've gone with the lower estimate. What this is it's taking up a really, really big site to build what you could describe, some people describe as a ground scraper. We've seen a few skyscrapers today. This is our first ground scraper. Possibly the Lloyd's of London, you could say, was a bit of a ground scraper as well. But it's just huge, it's low. Partly the reason it's low is, again, that pesky view of St Paul's that we came across earlier with the tapered Cheese Grater. That view of St Paul's, which is quite near to here, it can't be tampered with. And so as a result, they've got to keep the buildings low. But then keeping the buildings low has then transmorphed into these sort of beautiful results, because you've got to create an exquisite and intimate experience for people as they arrive here. I really like the Bloomberg. I think journalists should have really nice offices. I think in the present age we should celebrate information and give them a decent space to work in.
Better offices for journalists.
Yeah.
Also for the makers of live streamed architectural tours, please.
So we're going to swiftly move on from Bloomberg London.
Well, let's just say a couple of things about
Okay.
it, because one of the things that when they presented the Bloomberg, they made a big deal about its sustainability credentials. And it was described as the most sustainable office building in the world, right?
Oh yeah, lowest sustainable office building.
Which is, you know, it is in some regards in that it uses a very small amount of energy to heat itself and cool itself and light and so on. But it took an enormous amount of energy and resources to build it in the first place.
Yes.
And this raises a really kind of crucial question about contemporary architecture, is like, if we focus just on the heating and cooling costs and not on the amount of energy it takes to make a building in the first place, are we actually missing out quite a big chunk of what it'll take to address climate change through architecture? And even Spencer de Grey, who's the head of design at Norman Foster, Foster and Partners, points out this. He gave a lecture in China where he was saying, you know, if we built all buildings to the standard of the Bloomberg building, we'd still overshoot 3 degrees of global warming. So
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
the most sustainable building in the world maybe isn't sustainable enough for the situation we face at the moment.
Unfortunately, we can't go inside the Guildhall yard. It seems to be closed with 4 whole signs telling us there's no public access. So it's quite emphatically communicated, if in quite a sort of brash sense, for the fact that what we have before us is one of the most important buildings in the city, if not in the country, the Grade 1 listed Guildhall, yet another Grade 1 listed building on our journey today. Now, like the Bloomberg, it's made out of heavy materials. You know, there's massive timber beams and huge amounts of stone and other materials that went into building this. The thing is, this building's been here for nearly 600 years, so that represents pretty good value for money in terms of environmental impact. So sadly, we can't really give you a better view of the city because they've decided to close what I think is one of my favourite public spaces in London, which is the Guildhall Yard. Quite sad, actually. It's such an impressive bit of cityscape. It's something we can't share with you today, but you can sort of get some glimpses here between the edges, the security guards. You can see that it's a big square. It contains the Guildhall Art Gallery, and then also this building here, which is a...
That's why it's a testing centre. They're using it for COVID stuff.
Oh, right, okay. Thankfully, we don't have to go in there.
Okay, well let's go on to like my favourite public space in London, which is the Barbican Centre and housing estate. Is your bike okay?
I don't know. It's really weird. Okay, yes. So we're on our way to the Barbican Centre. Anyone who's encountered it before will have their spirits lifted. Anybody who's never seen or been to the Barbican Centre is in for a real treat. But before we get to the Barbican Centre, we're going to go past Wood Street Police Station. This is a building by Merlin and Whitby in the 60s. The 60s, an era we traditionally associate with modernist office buildings. Hey, but this is quite a sort of classically inspired big old heavy stone building. One of those big old heavy stone buildings that are pretty sustainable if they last for centuries. There's been a bit of a controversy around this one. But Merlin and Whitby are sort of architects that have had a bit of a renaissance in their appreciation. People really like them again. But the building itself, the police are moving out of it. They're moving to a super brand new headquarters on Fleet Street, somewhere else in the city. And so the building was up for redevelopment. It was supposed to be redeveloped as a police station, but now there's a proposal to transform it into a hotel. And the proposal would see a sort of tower squeezed in here, although it will be reasonably, as it's said by conservation groups, reasonably sympathetic to the existing structure. Anyway, there you go. That's Wood Street, one of the less famous views, but certainly a view that we enjoy on this brief interlude on the way to the Barbican Estate. But you've got to brace yourselves. We're going into the Barbican. You're going to have some of the best views of the city. Another fantastic example of the many styles and eras that can be experienced within a few seconds of each other on any visit to this beautiful place. So we're going up. This infrastructure wasn't designed for cyclists, but we found a way to get it to work for us. So we're going from the street level to the sky level, and we're doing it via this post-modern office building called Alban Gate. It's designed by Terry Farrell. We haven't had much postmodern architecture in this tour. It sort of sits in an in-between space, but this is from the 1980s. It's quite brave because what it did is it built an office building right on top of a road. So where there'd been nothing, it made something. And it didn't just make something, it made something with this raised, almost like a raised piazza space. So here we're entering it now. You've got benches, you've got planters, which are a bit empty, full of stones. You've got a bit of a wind up here, and you've got some retail spaces. In fact, retail spaces which are empty, which is probably a sad reflection of the times. So anyway, here we are. We're entering Barbican. We're in Barbican territories now. So we're going to go left. So here we go. We're on the Skywalk. Skywalk is a very beautiful place for city fans and architecture fans. It's a space which is designed to keep pedestrians separate from car users. And we're here, we're opening up into this grand vista, another view. What do we have before us? It says 140 London Wall. Down beneath us to the right, the fragments of the Roman wall, the ancient fortifications of this fortress city. To the left, some more of those remains. And this is part of the Barbican Estate. This is the Museum of London, designed by Powell and Moyer and opened in the 1970s. Here, the story of London's ancient formation, right up to the present day, is told through fascinating objects. Unfortunately, it's closed today.
This is so the pedway is this raised level that we're at is an extraordinary kind of side story in the City of London, because the plan was in the 20th century that this raised level would cut across the entire borough, right? The entire square mile would be gifted these raised areas so that people like us, pedestrians and cyclists, wouldn't have to get down and mingle with cars, and there could be a total separation between these two realms.
Oh, it sounds quite nice.
Never actually happened, but the Barbican and the sort of surrounding infrastructure and buildings around the Barbican is maybe the one bit where they have built most of this pedestrian realm. I guess that whole kind of urban school of thinking kind of died a death, and actually we've realised that the solution isn't to separate people and cars, it's just to reduce the number of cars, and yes. That's the kind of thrust of contemporary urbanism. But back in the 50s and the 60s, when they're designing all of this, it was very different. There was an idea that you could achieve a kind of two cities within one city. But we're going to see different examples of how the pedway has been executed in different architectural styles as we move around this estate.
I think given the sort of solidity of some of these and the evident appreciation of people that are here, you can imagine this will be here for a long time, these pedways, and I rather hope that at some point it goes full circle and the pedway vision comes back and there's a new enthusiasm which says, yeah, let's go and let's build those pedways again, and the Barbican is gently knitted back into the city. Well,
it's a very compelling urban idea, right? It's very three-dimensional. At the moment, British urbanism, the consensus seems to be, make little twee streets. And, I love streets, but the Barbican and the surrounding area really demonstrates another kind of urbanism that is maybe more spatial and more complex. It's interesting. Shall we go through the Museum of London into the Barbican?
Yes, let's do that. So we're going to keep travelling, and we're going to take you to one of the final epic views, an epic view that we think shows off some of the most compelling features of the Barbican Estate. The Barbican Estate, we'll come back to that, we were discussing earlier, the City of London, so the City of London Corporation, like many local authorities in its time, thank you very much, was engaged in building housing. But other bits of the UK, they built social housing. So it's like affordable housing for working people in the City of London. Because the sort of nature of the people and the demographic who worked here was slightly different, they built more of a kind of aspirational, you could say, council housing. So this was aimed at the middle classes, the bank workers, and it was to provide a sort of high quality urban environment for them to live out their lives which pivoted between the modernist office building and the modernist residence. So it's quite an uncompromising statement, but it's a sort of deluxe housing estate, because unlike so many others where those raw personal and cultural amenities were left out, here it's gone big. So you've got not only a bar and a restaurant and a laundrette and locksmiths and shoe repairs and all the things you'd have in a normal townscape, but you've also got an art centre, but not just any old art centre, probably one of the world's most important art centres, the Barbican Centre. It's got a concert hall, it's got a theatre, it's got an art gallery, it's got 2 art galleries actually. There's a library. It has lots of really fun events. People really enjoy coming here. I think there's an interesting point to be made here about the sort of defensive references going on.
Right, we started at the Tower Bridge and then the Tower of London, which had a very kind of castle-like appearance. And we're now looking at a much more contemporary brutalist architecture from the mid to late 20th century. But again, it kind of looks and feels a little bit like this sort of imposing castle, right? This big dip down here is a little bit like a moat. There's these fortified walls that seem to be overgrown with plants, a little bit like a sort of ruined Bastille or something. And then the building itself has this kind of toughness, right? The concrete has been bush hammered so that it has it really expresses how rugged it all is. Those are all choices that the architects made, partly because this is the site of the old wall of London. The Roman wall, which surrounded the city, ran right through this space. And so when they were building it, it was a kind of recurring motif in the inspiration for the design. These slit windows to our left, to me, these recall kind of balustraria from which you could imagine a medieval longbow, an archer firing arrows out at an enemy. Here they're just kind of letting some light in, but I think there's a poetry going on, which is hard to deny.
Absolutely. So here we are in a spot with these grand vistas. Going out here to the right, you can see the beautiful parkland that exists exclusively for the residents of the Barbican. We can see our parkour brothers. We ride bikes. They explore cities by jumping around off things. It's a fantastically interesting space.
Should we trundle along this? Because this really demonstrates the separation of people and cars. Beneath us, there is a huge road called Beach Street.
Oh, Beach Street is a nightmare if you ever cycled through it. You'll remember that road.
It is a formidable subterranean motorway. But on top, here we have this street, which is very different in character, very quiet, very pleasant, planting. This is a water feature, so there's even kind of like a small artificial lake. Totally different world, and that, I guess, this really shows you what they were going for when they were trying to separate people and cars. This was the kind of this was the payoff for all that effort.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, for me, I think, one of the great views of the City of London. You've got these towers here. They're the kind of highlight, the high living of the Barbican. If you live in the Barbican, that's one thing, but what you really want to do is you want to live in one of these towers with the amazing views. You can see these pretty much everywhere in London, and what that says is that if you lived in them, you can see pretty much everything from them. So they're a great spot with a commanding view. They're sort of raised up above the other towers. So really good, really interesting way of seeing things.
When they were built, I think they were the tallest residential buildings in Europe. They are triangular in plan. There's 3 apartments per floor, and they, if you ever manage to sneak in, you can go up the fire escape all the way to the top and have a look out. Quite incredible. And then here, this is the Frobisher Crescent, which originally was mostly facilities for the Art and Drama School and the Art Centre and some offices and cinemas in there. They've converted quite a lot of it to housing now, but it still has lecture theatres in there and other cultural facilities.
It's one of the many buildings in London that was turned into a model that you can cut out and assemble at home as part of the Open House Festival this year. One of the many dynamic ways we've responded to the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves, and many of you listening will have experienced as well, wherever you are. Hope you've enjoyed this tour of the epic streets and views of the City of London. Many of you will have noticed that we skipped the Q&A. We just had so much fun. We thought we'd keep going. So apologies and thank you for your understanding. But do email us and get in touch if you're interested in these tours, if you'd like to join us on one, or you'd like us to come and do one in your city.
Well, thank you for coming to Open House Worldwide. This has been an extraordinary collaboration between architectural enthusiasts all over the world, and we're very happy to have been invited to be part of it, sharing the love from London under lockdown. I'm Finn Harper, this is Merlin Fulcher, and
signing up.
See you next time. That was pretty good.
Oh god, that woman at the Alban Gate really freaked me out.
I just ignored it.
I know. It's like there's one thing like stressing the security guards, there's another like the head of the Residents Association at Barbican.